Welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik, Skopil here on the show. Tuesday afternoon when we're recording it. Jared is at a baseball media availability, so that's why he's not on the podcast. Look for stuff on Waz's program on duckterritory.com later this week. But Erik, we've got a football game. That's our primary focus right now. Football is king, and there's a huge road game for the University of Oregon. 1 p.m. kickoff. Fox is on the broadcast up in Pullman. We've got injury news. We've got some practice report information, as well as some feedback from Lanning, as well as multiple players on the offensive side of the football. Tuesday was an offensive media day approach. But let's start here with injuries, because there's some that are concerning. There's some that I think Oregon can kind of handle. And we've gotten some updates on a few of these guys. Who should we start? Should we start with Stephen Jones first? It feels like that's maybe the most notable one.
Yeah, let's start with Stephen. We talked about it in the lead up last week. None of us thought he'd play. We were right. He didn't play on Saturday against BYU. But not only that, I think what was concerning was we mentioned we saw him on crutches. He was on a scooter with a big boot on his left foot. And Dan Lanning was asked on Monday if he had any kind of timeline for Stephen. He just said he was hopeful he'd play this season, but didn't have kind of a timeline or dates that he thought he knew when Jones might be back. So, I think, Matt, we're kind of expecting this is one that could carry through maybe the bye week, maybe even into the end of October. Certainly a player that Oregon would love to have out there, but I just don't think you can rely or count on Stephen Jones to be available probably until the stretch run almost in late October, early November. Oregon has its bye week middle October. So I don't think you expect to see him before the bye week, and you probably don't, from my vantage point, expect to see him right away after when they play UCLA. I think that's October 22nd. Maybe it's UCLA, maybe it's the weekend after, maybe it's the first game of November. But I think that's kind of the range you're looking at with an injury, and that's too bad because he's a big part of that offensive front. But I think we saw, obviously, an offensive line perform really, really well without him over the weekend, with Harper at left guard and Walk at right guard and rotating those guys. In fact, on rewatch, one of the things that Jared noticed that I hadn't picked up, but I went back and found it. He's right. There was a series in the second half where they actually moved Harper off of left guard, put TJ Bass at left guard, and had Dawson Jaramillo playing left tackle. Kind of interesting, a little bit notable. They're clearly kind of working and trying to figure out the best combinations of this. But there's kind of your update with Jones. I think we'll probably still see Harper at left guard, Walk at right guard. Yeah. Maybe we'll see kind of some experimenting, but I would expect that's what we see in Pullman this week. And then two other injuries that are pretty notable right now that we're tracking are Justin Flo and Byron Cardwell. Another player played on Saturday against BYU. Both did show up in uniform, go through warmups, try to give it a go. Neither was able to do it. I think we're looking at ankle, feet kind of injuries here for both of them. We should note today's Tuesday practice. They both were out there. Dan said on Monday they were out there. He also said he was hopeful. Didn't say they were 100%, but he said he was hopeful that they could help this weekend. Hopeful is kind of the new word he's using to kind of talk about injuries, rather than go into too much details. Just that we're hopeful they'll be ready. We're hopeful they'll be available. So that's kind of the prognosis for those two. Looked like Cardwell did pretty much everything when media watched. There was a special teams drill. He caught balls, and there was a mod bracket drill, which is a tackling drill. He caught the football and ran and was tackled and all that. So that was positive. I don't know if Flo did the same mod bracket drill from a tackling perspective, but it was hard to ID everybody from our vantage point. They had a lot of players covering it, but seems like those two have a chance to go this weekend, which would be good. I don't think there's really a whole lot else. We know Popo's out for the year. We know Afease and Poti are dealing with serious injuries. Kyler Casper
wasn't at practice.
Today's practice, which is probably notable, but who knows? We'll see. He didn't play on Saturday, but a lot of receivers didn't play. So that's one to note. But he's so far on the depth chart that's not super significant one way or the other.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say there with Casper. Is he seems like he's going to be a good player, but he's just not in the rotation right now. And so it's notable, but it's anything to freak out about. Now, from a rotational standpoint, it's going to be interesting to see how this offensive line performs this weekend against Washington State, because obviously Stephen Jones did not play much the last 2 weeks, or hasn't played at all the last 2 weeks. Ryan Walk is back in action. There's some shuffling around, but the thing that, or this isn't new for Oregon, but what is going to be new is they're playing outside the confines of Autzen Stadium. And we haven't seen how this team has kind of handled that since week 1 against Georgia, when they were playing in Atlanta and Walk had to not play in the game in the second half because of injury. Marcus Harper did fine, but now you're throwing in other bodies, other players. That's going to be something to watch Saturday in Pullman. And that kind of goes into maybe our next segue here is, we were talking about this just among the media members on Tuesday in between practice and media session, and kind of dawned on all of us that there's only one player, I think, to our knowledge, on this Oregon roster that's played a game for Oregon in Pullman with fans. Mm-hmm. And that's Carson Battles, a guy that, important piece to the puzzle, no doubt about it, but maybe only plays 10, 15 snaps a game. So
sometimes less than that. I mean,
yeah, sometimes less than that. He's the long snapper. So this is a situation where Oregon's going into what's going to be a hostile environment. I think you and I think Mario Cristobal is scarred by 2018. I'll say it. I don't think Mario Cristobal thought Pullman and Martin Stadium was going to be an issue with the noise. I think he looked at the crowd size. Oh, it's nothing. It's in a small town. There's nowhere, it's not going to be that loud. And today, Forsyth said that 2018 game, he didn't play in it, but he was on the sidelines. He said it was the loudest building he's ever been in. And I don't know if we're going to get that environment, because it's a 1 p.m. kick. Game day was in Pullman for that 2018 game. But I think it's going to be crazy. It's going to be loud. It's close to a darn near sellout if it doesn't sell out before kickoff. Washington State will come in confident. Their fans will be coming in confident. And this is going to be a storyline to watch, is how does Oregon respond to this kind of atmosphere, even though it's Martin Stadium, which doesn't hold, I think, even 40,000 people.
Yeah, I just looked it up, Matt. 33,000 is about capacity. I mean, it's I think the smallest in the conference, assuming Oregon State isn't in its current circumstances where they're renovating Reeser, and it's like partial capacity. It's not a big stadium, but it is so loud for Oregon fans that have been there. They know that. For Oregon fans who haven't been there and are maybe going for the first time this weekend, be prepared. I mean, it is a loud environment. Pullman is a football city. And I think Matt's also right that last time in 2018, I think it's one of the louder times, probably one of the louder experiences at that stadium at Martin, just because game day was there. It was an evening, I think it was a night game. I forget what kickoff was, Matt. Do you remember? Was that 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, something like that?
I think it was like a 5 p.m. It was the ABC game.
Yeah, okay. So it was a 5:30 game, something like that.
Yeah.
And it was a day of everybody getting ready for the game, and it was a madhouse. So be prepared for that. Both Forsyth and Walk talked about how they addressed the team, because, as Matt said, it was funny when we were running through that, going like, yeah, Oregon hasn't played in Pullman since 2018 with fans. When you go through the roster, and it's kind of startling to think of how few players on this team were even on that team, and then you go, how many were actually playing? And we ended up, I think we're spot on this. Carson Battles is the only Oregon player to play a game for Oregon there. Chase Cota in 2019 played in that crazy UCLA Washington State game where it was 67-63.
We watched that in some hotel room. I don't know where that was at.
I think somewhere in the Bay Area. I think, or Oregon had played Cal and Stanford, maybe Cal or Stanford that day. Probably would be Stanford based upon years. Anyway, that was just one of the craziest games. But that's the only other Oregon player that we think has played a game at Martin, besides Andrew Boyle, who's a kicker who was on the team at Washington State last year before transferring. But it's just not a lot of guys who have experience there. And so Alex Forsyth, Ryan Walk, two of the veteran guys who didn't play in that game but were on the team and on that sideline, said they addressed the team and were like, hey, guys, be ready for this. This is not going to be – it might be 33,000, but it's going to feel like a lot more than that. And as Matt said earlier, Forsyth said, loudest stadium environment he's been in. Think about some of the places they've played games in the last couple of years with Forsyth. Think about the fact that they were in Columbus last year. Obviously, they've been in some big bowl environments where there are a ton of fans there. There was the game in Atlanta earlier this month. Big stadium, a lot of fans there, a lot of Georgia fans. Just to say that about Martin says a lot. And he's right, though, because the fans in the student section are right on the field. And it's going to be something to contend with. And for Oregon and its offensive line, I think you're in a good spot that it is a veteran group. But we have to note that 2018 team was also a pretty experienced offensive line. You think about how many guys were back,
and they struggled.
Group, and they struggled mightily. I mean, Matt, Matt still has the vision of Justin Herbert on the sideline after a couple bad Jake Hansen snaps using some not nice. This is one of the very few times you'll ever see Justin Herbert use 4-letter words. Was following a bad sequence to start that game. And as fans remember, Oregon got blasted pretty good in that game. I think they rallied and made it pretty close late. Actually had a chance to tie it in like the last couple of minutes. But they got down, I want to say 21, 24 points in the first half. It was ugly. This is going to be a tough environment. And I think it helps a lot to have Walk and Forsyth there to reiterate to the team what it's going to be like. It helps that you have Bo Nix, who's played in kind of raucous SEC environments before as a quarterback. But for a lot of these guys, this is going to be a kind of a totally new environment for them.
Yeah, I mean, I've had mixed opinions on going to Pullman and games being played in Pullman. But this is one of them where I don't know. I'm kind of jacked up to see this game because Washington State's undefeated. It's going to be a good environment. It's a day game, so I'm just happy we don't have to drive back to our hotel room in pitch dark of darkness because there's literally nothing else out there. And Oregon's going to be good too. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch the chess match between Oregon's offensive line and Bo Nix against the turnovers and the big plays that Washington State's defense makes. I think there's that idea that when Alex Grinch was the defensive coordinator there, they certainly had big play ability. They ran a tough defense. They had that defensive end. I can't pronounce his last name, but his first name was Hercules.
Mataafa.
Mataafa. He just destroyed teams. And I don't know if this team has that player where you're like, he's a definite NFL guy. He's an All-American type guy. But that being said, Washington State does have a senior linebacker that's just putting up insane numbers. And this defense itself creates turnovers and explosion plays. And it's going to be a chess match.
Yeah, and Dan references the havoc rate. I think Washington State has to have like the craziest havoc rate in the country right now. Because it's funny because we look on the message board, and I made this comparison. I don't know if it was on a podcast from the message board where Oregon fans, they think about Washington State, they think of Mike Leach, they think of the air raid, they think throw the ball over the field, they think probably not a great defense. This team is defensive minded, and its head coach Jake Dickert was the defensive coordinator, known to be a great defensive coach. And it's showing there. They are second in the country in tackles for loss. They have 30 in 3 games. That's 10 per game.
Jeez.
That's a ton. They have 14 sacks. That's almost 5 per game. By the way, Oregon has, I think, 3 sacks right now, and Washington State has 14. They led the country last year, and again, Dickert's been there for this run with 21 forced fumbles. They are very aggressive going after the football. Oregon, and I think it's a fun, as you said, chess match. It's going to be good on good, because Oregon's offensive line has yet to allow a sack, and they're going against the second best team in the country at creating sacks. So it's going to be a challenge. And we talked to several offensive linemen, asked kind of what they do so well. They said they have, Ryan Walk and TJ Bass are 2 different humans, not Ryan Bass, but Ryan Walk said that Washington State's really twitchy guys. Ron Stone Jr. was a all-conference first-team defensive lineman last year. He's back. He actually hasn't been as productive as some of these other guys. Brennan Jackson has, I think, 4.5 sacks in 3 games. Dion Henley, who Matt was just talking about, is an inside linebacker whose stat line is ridiculous. Through 3 games, I was looking at this yesterday. I slacked it to Matt and Jared because I was like, holy cow. Dion Henley, 30 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and an interception in 3 games. And that's like a half a season of stats for a really good player, and he's got it in a quarter of a year. So they've got some guys. And then the other thing that stood out to Bass in particular was kind of the pre-snap movement. They're gonna shuffle their guys. They're gonna do some stemming. They're gonna move their players left. They're gonna move their players right. They're gonna try to create mismatches with pre-snap movement where the offensive line is sort of surprised in where they're coming from. And Bass did say that and some of the exotic kind of blitzing that Washington State will bring will be similar to some of the stuff Oregon does defensively. But, it's never exactly what they're used to. So there will be some challenges in kind of handling that. But this is going to be the biggest test. I don't want to say yet because Georgia's obviously just on a different planet from a talent and athletic perspective. But since Georgia, this will be a bigger test than BYU. Oregon ran the ball all over them. BYU was out a couple defensive linemen, and Oregon just plowed it down their throat. Washington State, I think, is 3rd nationally in rushing yards defense. Like, this is a good Washington State defense, and its defensive front has been a real problem this year. So not your normal Cougar team. I think the more you dig into the numbers, you're kind of going like, oh, they still call it the Cougar grade. They do throw the football a decent amount. They include their tight ends. They do a bit of this. They do a bit of that offensively. But I think it's their defense that really is the thing that you kind of have to go into this game being ready for.
Real quick note about Henley. I don't think you mentioned this. I was trying to find some defensive stats to also talk about this, so maybe I missed it. I don't think I did, though. He was a receiver at Nevada, which makes his statistics that he's doing right now even more impressive. This isn't some guy that has been waiting his time to play linebacker and honing on his skills for 4 years and then getting his chance of playing and doing it. He transferred to Washington State this season.
Yeah.
And he made the move after the 2019 season to defense. So he spent 2020 and 2021. He was an all-conference Mountain West player in 2021 as a linebacker, 6th in the Mountain West Conference in tackles. But he started his career as a receiver and moved to linebacker. To do what he's doing is pretty darn impressive and probably putting himself at least at minimum on the radar for NFL teams. Because if you've got the speed to play college receiver and can now bulk up to 232 pounds to play linebacker, I've just got this feeling that NFL teams are going to be tracking him. Not saying he's going to be a draft pick or anything like that, but certainly something to watch there.
By the way, Matt, who's really bummed? Ken Wilson, the new Nevada coach.
Yes.
Linebackers
Love
coach.
to have him.
Probably going, oh, that guy should have been on our team. That's too bad.
Should have had him. And we talked a lot last week for Oregon, Erik. This was a game against BYU that we'd learn a lot about this team for Oregon. I feel like this is that same scenario for both Oregon and Washington State, because let's start with the Cougars first here. You ran through all the impressive plays that they've done, tackles for loss, sacks. They have, like you said, 30 tackles for loss this season. 24 of them have come against Idaho and Colorado State. Yep. And then you look at their sacks, they've got 14. 13 of those, Idaho and Colorado State. They had just 1 sack against Wisconsin. They had just 6 tackles for loss against Wisconsin. If this defense is as good as advertised, their numbers need to show up against Oregon. And on the flip side, if we kind of think Oregon is who they are, a New Year's 6 type team, someone that can win 9 to 10 games, be in that New Year's 6 conversation at the end of the year, not necessarily get there, but be in the discussion, these numbers need to be closer to what Wisconsin did than what Idaho and Colorado State couldn't prevent. Oregon's offensive line should flex here and be able to protect Bo Nix and be able to establish the run game, because if Oregon is as good as we think they are, that should be what happens in this football game.
And I think the other thing that stands out here is this needs to be a good Bo Nix game, and I know
Yes.
that sounds probably really simplistic, and it is, and I know you want to say that about every game. You need your quarterback to play well, but if you go back to that Wisconsin Washington State game from September 10th, that was their big upset on the road in Madison. No one really saw it coming. They're pretty big underdogs. Wisconsin was ranked number 19 at the time. That game flips in part just because of the way that defense turned the ball over, or forced turnovers on Wisconsin, we should say. They forced 3 turnovers in that game. Wisconsin gained 400 yards. Washington State gained 253. Wisconsin had 22 first downs. Washington State had 10. You run through some of these stats. I mean, Wisconsin 8 of 15 on third down. Washington State was 2 for 11, and yet they win the game 17-14. You know, they forced these turnovers in big spots, and that's what flipped the game. And their quarterback, Graham Mertz, he was the one who threw an interception. You can't be doing that if you're Bo Nix. His receivers fumbled the ball in space. One of his running backs fumbles the ball in space. This is a game, again, I mentioned it earlier, Washington State. These aren't aberrations, these stats. They had 21 forced fumbles last year in 12 games, 13 games. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to be a team you have to really mind kind of how you're carrying the football and managing it. So I think that's another big part here is for Bo in particular, just because we've seen the turnover prone, not just at Oregon, but at Auburn. He needs to be on his best because for Oregon to win this game, they're going to need to execute, and they can't have mistakes at the quarterback position. And for players in the open field, protect the football. Be aware that this is a really good team at knocking the ball out. Oregon, by the way, has been really good at protecting the football this year. I think I might think I'm right in this, right? Aren't the only 2 turnovers this year the 2 Bo Nix interceptions? They haven't had a fumble.
And then Ty Thompson had the interception that hit Thornton in the hands, and
sure. So they've had 3 interceptions, but no fumbles.
No fumbles.
Yeah. So that's a trend you want to have continue this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the flip side, we're going to talk defense with Oregon's players on Wednesday, and we'll maybe talk more about it then. But Oregon's defense, if they can create a couple or maybe gets doing what they did against BYU and getting 4th down stops. I think they had 3 of them.
I think 4.
4. So if you can get some stops in that way, even that creates opportunities, and you got to be able to execute and finish drives and score touchdowns. And like you said, though, it goes with Bo Nix. And I think this is maybe where we end this podcast. This discussion point is just, you're right. He has to play a good game. And I don't think we've seen the last 2 weeks, a good game from Bo Nix doesn't mean he needs to throw for 450 yards and 5 touchdowns.
Right.
I mean, he was nearly perfect against BYU and only attempted 18 throws, had 3 rushing touchdowns, sure, but 222 yards passing. I think he ran for like 36 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground, 2 touchdowns through the air. If you can get the two-way dual threat with Bo Nix, and he plays smart, and he even admitted, like, getting behind the sticks is when mistakes happen. And if Oregon can stay ahead, gain some positive yardage on 1st and 2nd down, then you face 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4 instead of 3rd and 9 like they often faced against Georgia. This offense is going to be, clicking, and things will be going well, and you won't have to have, these deep shots taken down the field, which we've clearly seen with Bo. When he's throwing the short stuff, the intermediate stuff, he's really, really good, and he's not going to make a lot of mistakes in that area.
I agree. For Bo, it's simplifying kind of what you're expecting. And I think you go back to the the Georgia game, and you look at the mistakes he made. One, he's trying to force the ball downfield. Ball gets intercepted. Great play by the defense. And the other one, I don't know if that's a misread or just a misunderstanding of where the ball needs to go. But that ball was just I think that was just a pretty big mental error. And again, I'm not a quarterback. Maybe there's something I'm missing there, but I've gone and watched that play from a bunch of different angles, and I just don't see where that play was going to be successful. But you look at the last 2 games, it just doesn't feel like he's really had many. Either there haven't been many options to throw the ball in those type of windows, or if there have been, it's almost exclusively been with the understanding of like, hey, it's third down. Let's find a spot in the middle of the field that's easy to complete, rather than trying to force the ball into a tight window, rather than trying to throw the ball vertically down the field. And that's part of what I've loved about the offense is, obviously each route tree, each play is going to probably have a variety of options and whatnot.
Right.
But it seems like the options that he's settling upon, that I'm assuming earlier reads for him, are passes that are very easy for him to complete. And the receivers have done a good job, especially I think the last 2 games of getting open. And Washington State, we'll see how they hold up against an Oregon offense that's pretty dual in what it can do. I mean, I think I saw a couple people saying, hey, you can't ask Bo Nix to win you the game, and I think that's true. But the thing that's been really positive through the last 2 games in particular, and even to a lesser extent against Washington State, is just the success they've had consistently running the football. They've been able to run the ball really, really well, and that's set up Bo Nix for third and manageables. That's set up the offensive line so that the routes don't have to be as long for them to be completed, and that's why you don't have as many sacks necessarily, right? It's 3rd and 6. The receiver has to only, run 6 to 8 yards to get past the sticks to get open, and that you're not asking Bo to hold the ball for 3 or 4 or 5 seconds and the offensive line to manage their blocks for that time period. I think it's crucial to have success early on in downs and then find routes that are manageable for him and not try to ask him to do too much. And I think that's what we've seen the last couple of games. I think that's easier said than done against Washington State, though, with all of the havoc they try to wreak on a team, with how disruptive they are. If they win a couple of those downs where it's a run or a pass play that's a sack or a tackle for a loss, that's how you get yourself off schedule. And that's why I think it's really critical to win on those downs, because if you're facing 3rd and 15, that might be the place where Bo starts to try to force the ball somewhere that it's a tougher place to go. Because I don't have all the data in front of me here. It feels like a lot of the third down conversions the last couple of weeks have been in the 3rd and 4 to 8 range, rather than being on the 3rd and 10 and longer range where it's a little bit more difficult to convert.
It's going to be an interesting storyline to watch. Bo Nix versus Washington State's defense, what the environment's going to look like, how Oregon responds to this environment. And look, it's a new staff. It's a new team. It's a big September game. We've seen it before. Washington State doesn't have on paper the same talent that Oregon does, yet sometimes these games are really close. And then sometimes we kind of get games like in 2020 when Oregon went up there and just destroyed Washington State. That game wasn't close for the Cougars. The Ducks just kind of blew them out. And what do we get on Saturday? It's going to be interesting to find out. I'm curious to see how this thing plays out. We'll have more coverage of this game leading up to it on duckterritory.com. We'll have a full podcast with our Cougar site, Coug Fan. We'll have one of their writers on later this week to kind of give you the full preview. We'll have the game picks, which will come out Friday. And then Saturday's game, we'll be back on the show as well with a post-game edition from Martin Stadium. But until our next podcast, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks. Peace.